The dark interior. The salt-crusted air of the island didn't just hang, it pressed against the lungs like a wet wool blanket. Rachel nudged the heavy oak door with the toe of her sneaker. It shrieked, a long, rusted protest of iron hinges that set Rachel's teeth on edge. "Still want to play ghost hunter?" Sarah whispered. Her voice was too loud in the sudden, suffocating silence of the foyer. She hovered a half-step behind Rachel, her hand instinctively gripping the strap of her backpack, knuckles white. "It's just a house, Sarah. Wood and plaster. Gravity holds it together just like ours," Rachel said, though her bravado felt thin, like a coat bought for a winter that had arrived too early. They stepped inside. The air was colder here, smelling of stale dust, damp earth, and something metallic, the faint, sharp tang of old copper. Rachel clicked her flashlight on, the beam cutting a violent path through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light, swirling like microscopic debris after an explosion. The grand hallway stretched out before them, lined with portraits whose faces had been meticulously scratched away. The wallpaper hung in long, skin-like strips, revealing rotting lath beneath. It felt less like an abandoned home and more like the interior of a carcass. "Look at this," Rachel muttered, shining her light onto a side table. A collection of items lay arranged in a perfect, geometric circle, a blackened human tooth, a rusted sewing needle, and a small, leather-bound book with a dried, dark stain across the cover. It wasn't the chaotic decay of abandonment, it was intentional. It was an altar. Sarah stepped forward, her curiosity momentarily overriding her terror as she peered at the items. "Why would someone leave this here? This looks purposeful." "It's a dare, Sarah. People come here to freak themselves out," Rachel said, though she didn't touch the artifacts. She didn't want the residue of whatever dark intent had placed them there on her skin. "Yeah, but people leave beer cans and graffiti," Sarah countered, her eyes scanning the ceiling. "They don't leave stuff that looks like it belongs in a cult manual. We should go. Now." Rachel didn't answer immediately. She walked toward the grand staircase, her flashlight beam tracking a trail of dark, splattered droplets along the carpet runner. They weren't brown with age. They were still, against all logic, a dull, dried crimson. The house felt heavy, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for them to commit to the depth of the transgression. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's voice dropped to a barely audible rasp. Rachel froze. She held her breath, listening. At first, there was nothing but the rhythmic thrum of the ocean outside. Then, she heard it, a soft, rhythmic thud-drag, coming from somewhere deep within the structure, behind the walls themselves. "It's the house settling," Rachel said, though her pulse hammered against her throat like a trapped bird. "Old houses moan." "Houses don't walk, Rachel." That sounded like footsteps. Sarah grabbed Rachel's jacket, yanking her back toward the entrance. "We are leaving. We found the house." We stood in the creepy hallway. "The dare is done." Rachel looked toward the dark abyss of the hallway. The morbid urge to see what lay in the shadows, to prove that they were smarter, faster, and more capable than the legends, was a physical ache in her chest. She wanted to be the girl who went inside and came back out with a story that would define her. "Just a little further," Rachel whispered, stepping toward the shadow of the dining room. "If we leave now, we're just two girls who got scared by a draft. If we find out what's actually in here, we're the ones who solved the mystery of the island." "I don't want a mystery," Sarah hissed, gloom. But it didn't reveal the basement of a house, it revealed an ossuary. "Rachel," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't move forward. Her boots felt glued to the slick stone floor. "We need to go. Right now." Up the stairs, back to the boat. Rachel, whose curiosity usually burned like a beacon, stood frozen. She was staring at a wall covered in personal effects, a high school ring, a shattered smartphone screen, a pristine white sneaker missing its pair. These weren't artifacts of a long-dead past. The screen of the phone was still cracked from a recent impact, and the sneaker looked as though it had been dropped only hours ago. "These are people," Rachel murmured, her hand reaching out, trembling as she hovered over the pile. "Our age, Sarah. People who were dared just like us." "They didn't leave," Sarah said, stepping back, the beam of her light shaking violently across the damp masonry. "Nobody left. Look at the door." They both turned. The heavy iron-bound door they had used to descend into the bowels of the house was gone. In its place was nothing but solid, featureless stone. It hadn't been walled over. The masonry looked as old as the foundation itself, as if the exit had never existed, or as if the house itself had digested the passage behind them. "That's impossible," Rachel said, the stubborn edge in her voice sharpening into fear. She lunged forward, her palms slamming against the cold rock. She clawed at the surface, her fingernails scraping until they bled. It was right here. We came down the steps. We felt the draft. "The house is changing," Sarah said, a cold, hollow sensation blooming in her chest. She swung the light around the room, catching the glint of something reflective in the corners. Eyes. Multiple pairs of them, hanging just above the reach of the shadows, blinking with a rhythm that wasn't human. "We're being watched, Ratch. We were never just explorers. We were invited." "Invited to what?" Rachel demanded, spinning around to face the shadows. She stood taller now, her bravado warring with the primal terror vibrating through her limbs. "Show yourself. We're leaving." A low, resonant sound, not quite a growl, but the vibration of a predatory hum, echoed from the ceiling. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. "They like the noise, don't they?" Sarah whispered, backing until she hit the stone wall. "They're listening to us. Everything we say, they're eating it up." The room grew colder, the temperature plummeting until their breath misted in the beam of Sarah's light. A sharp, rhythmic clack-clack started from the darkness, the sound of long, polished nails tapping against stone. "Check the perimeter," Rachel commanded, though her eyes were darting wildly. "There has to be a drain, a ventilation shaft, something. We aren't dying in a hole, Sarah. Not today." Sarah forced her legs to move, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept the light moving, trying to maintain a sweep of the room, but the shadows seemed to recoil from the beam, retreating into corners only to spill out behind them. "There," Sarah gasped, pointing to a narrow, jagged fissure behind a stack of rotted wooden crates. It was barely wide enough for a human, but it looked like a natural sinkhole leading toward the cliffside. "Go," Rachel urged, pushing Sarah toward the gap. "I'll cover the back." "No, we go together." "Go." Rachel's voice cracked with a sudden, uncharacteristic authority. Sarah scrambled toward the fissure, her fingers digging into the grime-slicked wall. She squeezed through, the jagged stone tearing at her jacket, and dropped into a cramped, horizontal crawlspace. She waited, gasping for air, clutching the flashlight until her knuckles turned white. "Rachel?" Sarah whispered into the dark. A moment later, Rachel slid in behind her, her face pale, eyes wide and bloodshot. "They're not human," Rachel breathed, her voice a jagged whisper. "I saw one. It was pale, like paper, and its mouth." She stopped, clutching her shoulder. A thin, dark line of blood was beginning to soak through her sweater. "You're hurt," Sarah said, reaching out to touch the wound. Rachel shoved her hand away, her expression twisting into something unrecognizable, a flicker of pure, unadulterated aggression that lasted only a heartbeat before dissolving into agony. "I'm fine. Just a scrape. We keep moving." Sarah didn't believe her, but the suffocating atmosphere of the chamber was pressing in on them, the darkness behind them thickening into something tangible. They crawled forward, the tunnel winding deep beneath the island's crust. Every sound they made, the rustle of fabric, the scrape of boots, felt deafening, a flare sent into the dark for whatever was stalking them to follow. "They're playing with us, aren't they?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible, Like a cat with a mouse. Then we make sure the mouse has teeth, Rachel replied, though she was panting now, her movements losing their grace. She clutched her side, her head lolling back against the tunnel ceiling. Don't stop, Sarah. Whatever you do, don't stop moving. The tunnel opened up into a wider, circular shaft that clearly led upward, toward the ground floor of the house. But as Sarah aimed her light upward, the beam hit a pair of polished, leather-clad boots. The light traveled up. Tall, lean, and draped in a coat that seemed to absorb the light itself, a man stood blocking the way. His hair was a shock of vibrant, unnatural red, and his eyes, cold, dead, and impossibly sharp, were fixed on them with a predatory glee that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. He didn't speak. He just smiled, revealing teeth that were too long, too white, and far too sharp. Found you, he whispered. The sound wasn't loud, but it resonated in the small, enclosed space, vibrating through Sarah's skull. She didn't wait for him to move. She shoved Rachel hard toward a side passage and scrambled to her feet, raising the flashlight like a club. Run! Sarah screamed. But as Rachel tried to bolt, the man moved with a blur of motion that defied physics. He was across the gap in a blink, his hand clamping around Rachel's throat, lifting her effortlessly against the stone wall. Rachel's feet kicked uselessly at the air. Curiosity, the man purred, his voice like grinding glass. It's such a delicious trait, isn't it? It's exactly why we keep the door open. Sarah swung the flashlight, but he caught her wrist with his free hand, his grip like a steel vise. He twisted, and the flashlight clattered to the ground, the beam dying as it hit the dirt, plunging them into near-total darkness, save for the faint, sickly glow emanating from the man's eyes. No! Sarah shrieked, clawing at his arm. The man ignored her, his attention entirely on Rachel. He leaned in, his face inches from her neck. The air grew still, the silence of the island pressing in, heavy and final. You're a special one, he whispered. You won't break like the others. He sank his teeth in. The sound of the bite was a wet, tearing rip that echoed off the walls. Rachel didn't scream. She let out a choked, guttural gasp that dissolved into a low, terrifying moan as her body went rigid, then limp. The man tossed her aside like a discarded doll. She hit the ground with a sickening thud, her limbs splayed at unnatural angles. Rachel! Sarah lunged for her friend, but the man stepped between them, his posture languid, his red hair catching the dim light. He wiped a streak of blood from his lip, his expression one of absolute, sadistic delight. Now, he said, looking at Sarah as if she were the main course, let's see what you're made of. The basement was a cathedral of rot. Moist, black mold climbed the stone walls like veins, pulsating in the dim, flickering light of a dozen dying electric candles. Mark stepped into the pool of light, his movements liquid and predatory. He didn't walk, he glided, the heels of his polished boots making no sound against the damp floor. He wore a grin that looked like a jagged wound carved into his pale, aristocratic face. Rachel pressed her back against a rusted support beam, her chest heaving. Sarah, she whispered, her voice a thin, brittle thread. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you. Sarah's voice cracked, her hand clutching the strap of her bag so hard her knuckles were white. She scanned the shadows, her eyes wide, darting toward the stairwell. Mark chuckled, a low, melodic sound that didn't reach his dead, obsidian eyes. Leaving? There is nowhere left to go, little birds. The house doesn't like visitors who try to fly away before the meal is served. He lunged. It was faster than human reflexes could track. A blur of movement, a displacement of air that smelled of ozone and stagnant earth. Sarah screamed, throwing her heavy flashlight with desperate force. Mark caught it mid-air without looking, crushing the metal casing in his palm like it were wet tissue paper. The light died, plunging them into deeper, suffocating gloom. Rachel acted on pure, blind adrenaline. She grabbed a jagged, rusted iron pipe from the floor and swung it with everything she had. It connected with Mark's shoulder, a dull, sickening thud, but he didn't even flinch. He grabbed the pipe, his fingers sinking into the cold metal as if it were soft wax, and ripped it from her grip, tossing it into the dark. "Run, Sarah!" Rachel shrieked, pushing her friend toward the narrow corridor that branched off behind them. Sarah hesitated, her loyalty warring with the primal terror screaming in her marrow. She saw Mark's hand shoot out, his fingers lengthening, the nails sharpening into ivory talons. She turned, sprinting down the pitch-black hallway, her footsteps thundering against the floorboards. Rachel didn't get the chance to follow. Mark's hand clamped around her throat. The pressure was absolute. He lifted her off her feet, his strength effortless, pinning her to the rotting wood of the wall. She clawed at his wrist, but his skin felt like marble, cold, unyielding, and impossible to bruise. "You have such a vibrant pulse," Mark whispered, his face inches from hers. His breath was freezing, carrying the faint, metallic scent of copper. "It's a shame to waste it, but the others, they do love a fresh transformation. It keeps the island interesting." "Go to hell," Rachel choked out. Mark's grin widened, showing teeth that were perfectly, terrifyingly sharp. "I'm already there, love." He didn't wait. He drove his head down, his mouth snapping over the soft pulse point of her neck. The agony was instantaneous, a white-hot, searing jolt that felt like molten lead pouring directly into her bloodstream. Rachel thrashed, her world narrowing down to the rhythmic, invasive thrumming of Mark's hunger. It wasn't just a bite, it was an infection, a total systemic collapse of her humanity. She felt her veins begin to scream, a cold, icy tide rushing from the wound to her heart, replacing the steady, warm rhythm of her life with something jagged and predatory. Her vision tunneled. The last thing she saw was Mark's face, rapturous and cruel, as he pulled back, his lips stained with a deep, dark red. "Don't worry," he murmured, dropping her to the floor. She crumpled like a discarded rag doll. "The dying is the hardest part. The living, that's where the fun begins." Down the hall, Sarah skidded to a stop, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She heard the wet thud of Rachel hitting the floor, followed by the terrifying, echoing silence that followed. "Rachel," she sobbed, turning back, her courage tethered to her friend. She crawled back toward the basement threshold, her movements frantic, eyes streaming with tears. She found the chamber, but Mark was gone. Rachel lay curled on the damp concrete, shivering violently, her skin turning an alarming, translucent gray. "Rachel, oh God, please," Sarah gasped, falling to her knees beside her. She reached out, trying to lift her friend's head, but stopped. Rachel's eyes snapped open. They weren't human anymore. The whites were gone, replaced by a swirling, sunset orange iris, the pupils dilated into thin, vertical slits. A low, guttural vibration emanated from Rachel's chest, a sound that wasn't a growl, but the sound of something waking up inside her. "Rachel? It's me. It's Sarah." Rachel turned her head slowly, her neck cracking with a sound like dry kindling. She looked at Sarah, but the recognition was distorted, filtered through a veil of alien hunger. Her mouth opened, and when she spoke, her voice was layered, herself, but deeper, raspier, echoing with a hollow malice. "It hurts," Rachel whispered, the words trembling. Then, her face contorted in a flash of predatory hunger, her teeth grazing her own lip, drawing a bead of dark blood. Sarah recoiled, her hand hitting the floor. She saw the bite on Rachel's neck, the jagged, necrotic edge of the wound. It was already beginning to knit itself back together, the skin weaving over the puncture marks with terrifying, unnatural speed. "We have to go," Sarah said, her voice shaking, shifting into survival mode despite the bile rising in her throat. She hooked her arms under Rachel's shoulders, grunting as she heaved her up. Rachel was heavier than she should have been, dense, like stone. "I can't." Rachel groaned, her body spasming. "Sarah, leave me. I'm changing." "Shut up," Sarah snapped, a fierce, desperate edge cutting through her terror. She dragged Rachel toward the stairs. "I'm not losing you to this house. We're getting off this island, even if I have to carry you into the water." As they reached the base of the staircase, the heavy oak door at the top creaked open. A sliver of moonlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the silhouettes of figures standing on the landing. Jack, the vampire with the Irish lilt, leaned against the doorframe, idly flipping a silver stake between his long, pale fingers. Behind him stood two others, faceless, hollowed-out thralls with glassy, vacant eyes. "That's a very touching display of devotion," Jack called down, his voice dripping with amusement. "But the mistress doesn't like her experiments wandering off. Especially when they've already been marked for the cellar." Sarah stood her ground, pulling Rachel behind her, her eyes scanning the room for anything she could use as a weapon. She found a heavy, iron fire poker near the base of the stairs and snatched it up, her fingers trembling. "Get out of the way," Sarah hissed, her protective instincts turning into a cold, lethal focus. Jack laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Oh, the little one wants to fight. How darling." He beckoned to the two thralls. They moved down the stairs with unnatural fluidity, their limbs jerking like marionettes on tangled strings. They weren't human, and they didn't care about their own safety. They were empty vessels, driven only by the commands of the coven above. Rachel's breath hitched, a harsh, wheezing sound. She sagged against Sarah, her fingernails digging into Sarah's arm. "Sarah, watch out." Sarah didn't hesitate. As the first thrall reached the bottom step, she swung the iron poker with everything she had. It connected with the creature's temple, a hollow crunch echoing through the basement. The thrall crumpled, but didn't die, it just twitched, its neck bent at a sickening angle, beginning to stand back up. They don't stay down, Sarah realized, her stomach dropping. The reality of their situation crystallized. There was no running. There was only the hunt. "Back," Rachel whispered, a new, jagged strength entering her voice. She pulled away from Sarah, steadying herself. She stood tall, though she was still swaying, her eyes glowing in the dark. "Rachel?" Rachel turned to her, and for a split second, the human girl was back, scared, hurt, and desperate. "Don't look at them, Sarah. Look at me. We have to be faster than them." Before Sarah could reply, the second thrall lunged. Rachel moved. She was a blur of motion, slamming into the creature with a force that sent them both crashing into a stack of wooden crates. The splintering wood exploded outward. Rachel pinned the thrall against the stone wall, her hands moving with a lethal, instinctive precision Sarah had never seen before. She didn't struggle, she attacked. Jack's smile vanished. He descended the stairs, his posture shifting from amused observer to silent hunter. "She's fighting the transition," Jack muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Unfortunate. It makes them so much more difficult to break." Sarah stepped into his path, brandishing the poker, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of something else, the cold, sharpening spark of the hunter. She wasn't going to let them take Rachel again. "Come and get us," Sarah challenged, her voice trembling but firm. Jack lunged. The basement exploded into chaos. Rachel, caught in the throes of her transformation, surged forward to meet him, a feral snarl escaping her throat. Sarah followed, her eyes locked on the space between the monsters, ready to strike, ready to bleed, ready to do whatever was necessary to drag her friend out of the shadows and back into the light. The trap had sprung, but the prey had started to bite back.